Ever get that feeling, like you're being pulled in a bunch of different directions at once?
I know what you mean.
Yeah, like trying to make decisions with your head, but your gut is telling you something totally different. And then on top of all that, there's just so much information coming at us from every direction. It's hard to know what to trust.
Absolutely. It's overwhelming. So much to process. And that's precisely where we come in, right? The whole point of the deep dive is to take the sources you've brought us, dive deep into them together, and see if we can extract those golden nuggets of insight, something that's really going to be useful and relevant for you specifically.
Exactly. We're here to cut through that noise. And today we're doing just that with, let's see, pages 328 to 349 of your material. Looks like it's all about a devil.
That's fascinating stuff.
It's
Rich with symbolism and layers of meaning.
Now, just from glancing at it, this section seems to be all about the human experience, but kind of from a specific angle. Like, what does it actually mean to live this earthly life with all its limitations and challenges?
That's right. And there's even this sense of destiny, almost like our paths are predetermined in some way.
Yeah, I'm getting that too. Which actually reminds me of our conversation about Ufrith, if you remember, where we talked about how our own individual will interacts with these larger forces.
Exactly. And it seems like Ufthith is going deeper into that, showing us what that subordination to higher powers looks like in our day-to-day lives.
So we're not just talking about abstract concepts, we're talking about how these forces actually shape our experience.
Precisely. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this perspective sets the stage for the next part of your material, which, if I'm not mistaken, moves into Ufesk, where the themes of transformation and spiritual evolution really come to the forefront.
Right, like we're starting with a very grounded view of the human condition in Uveth, and then we'll see how that sets up the potential for transcendence and growth in Ufex.
Exactly. A journey from limitation to liberation.
So I guess our mission for this deep dive is to really understand what these pages of Ainth are telling us about human life.
Absolutely. What are the key characteristics being highlighted here? What are the limitations and constraints that we're up against?
And most importantly, how does this understanding prepare us for what seems to be a very different perspective in the teachings of Ainus?
Lots to unpack. So let's get into it. Right off the bat, the source material presents Adeth as a very specific kind of teaching, all about us, about earthly humans.
It's kind of like, here's the deal with being human, warts and all.
Right. The good, the bad, and everything in between. The whole journey of life, the suffering that's an inevitable part of that journey, and the limits on what we can do and the resources we have to work with.
It's not sugarcoating anything. It's very direct about the challenges we face.
And one of the key points it makes is that, according to this Arcanum, human life operates within a framework of destiny.
Destiny, like it's all predetermined. So where does free will come into play?
That's the big question, isn't it? But I think it's important to remember that in many spiritual traditions, destiny and free will aren't seen as mutually exclusive.
Okay. So maybe it's more about navigating within a set of predetermined circumstances.
Perhaps. But the point is that this idea of destiny really links back to what we were discussing earlier about Hue, with its focus on subordinating our personal will to higher powers.
Right. So maybe it's not about having no free will, but about recognizing that our choices are made within a larger context that we might not fully understand.
That's a really interesting way to put it. And I think that understanding is crucial because it sets up this tension between feeling limited on the one hand and then the potential for something much greater that we'll explore in Hue Chase.
It's like, here's the reality of being human, the limitations, the constraints, but don't worry, there's more to come.
Exactly. And it's within this context of trying to understand our earthly condition that the source material then goes into the nature of human thinking, specifically the dynamic between reason and intuition.
Okay, two very different ways of approaching the world.
Right. Reason, as it's presented here, is understood as coming from the active part of the human spirit. It's that analytical, logical part of us that engages with the world, breaks things down, figures things out.
The part that wants to understand how things work, why things are the way they are.
Exactly. It's very much about action, about doing things in the world. And then we have intuition, which is described as the passive counterpart to reason.
The more receptive feeling side.
Right. It's the part of us that picks up on subtle cues, that has those flashes of insight without necessarily needing to go through a logical process. It's about being open to receiving information rather than actively pursuing it.
So you could say reason is about figuring things out, and intuition is about just knowing things.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the source material really emphasizes that For us to truly evolve in a balanced way, we need both reason and intuition working in harmony.
It can't be all head or all heart, right? We need both to make good decisions, to understand the world, to live a fulfilling life.
Absolutely. And to illustrate this, it uses some really interesting examples from Greek mythology, showing what can happen when we overemphasize one aspect at the expense of the other.
Okay, I love a good myth. Let's hear it.
So one of the examples it uses is the story of Phineas.
Ah, Phineas, the blind king and prophet. Wasn't he the one tormented by those harpies who kept stealing his food?
That's right. And the text interprets his blindness, as well as the blindness of other mythical seers, as a necessary detachment from the physical world, a kind of prerequisite for inner knowing.
So by losing his physical sight, he gains a deeper kind of vision.
Precisely. But his constant suffering, the relentless hunger caused by the harpies, is seen as symbolic of what happens when we become too passive, when our active will is weak. He's unable to take the necessary steps to secure his basic needs, to participate fully in life.
He's so focused on the inner world that he neglects the practical demands of the outer world.
Exactly. And relief only comes through the intervention of the sons of Boreas, who represent this active, dynamic force driving away the harpies.
So it's a cautionary tale about what happens when we become too detached, too passive. Okay, and what's the other example?
Orpheus. Now, Orpheus represents the opposite extreme. Excessive activity, a neglect of the passive, receptive side.
Oh, yeah, the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. He was so driven by his love, so determined to bring her back from the underworld, that he couldn't even follow a simple instruction.
Exactly. He couldn't resist the urge to look back, and as a result, he lost her again. His active will, his desire, completely overshadowed his ability to be patient, to trust the process.
He couldn't surrender to the unknown.
Right. And his ultimate demise at the hands of the Bacchantes, who represent, in this context, passive initiation, really underscores the dangers of this imbalance. You can't force spiritual growth or creation. You have to respect the receptive, yielding aspects as well.
So it's like a constant dance, a delicate balance between reason and intuition, between doing and being.
Exactly. And building on this understanding of duality, the source material then introduces a fascinating concept. The idea that the human soul has two fundamental aspects, represented by what it calls the red man and the black man.
Okay, the red man and the black man. Tell me more about these figures. What do they represent?
The red man is described as the active, giving, free aspect of the soul. It's associated with intuition and the elements of fire and earth.
Fire and earth, okay. So what do those elements symbolize in this context?
Fire, it says, represents the power of synthesis, the ability to see the whole picture, to have a clear direction, and earth represents will in execution, the capacity to take those intuitive insights and bring them into reality.
So the red man is like the visionary, the one who sees the potential and then takes action to make it happen.
Exactly. And then we have the black man, who is presented as the passive, receiving, more restricted aspect of the soul. It's associated with reason and the elements of water and air.
Okay, so we've got the red man with fire and earth and the black man with water and air. It's interesting how each aspect has its own set of elements.
Right, and the text goes into detail about the symbolism of those elements as well. Air is associated with division, classification, gaining knowledge from the material world, what it calls knowledge from below. And water represents potential, that which can be realized through the knowledge acquired through air.
So the black man is more about analyzing, breaking things down, understanding the details.
Right. It's a different way of knowing compared to the red man's more intuitive, holistic approach. And the text emphasizes that these two aspects coexist within the human soul, each following its own inherent path.
Like two sides of the same coin, always present, always interacting.
And what's really fascinating is that their combined action is what ultimately drives human progress. The interplay between the intuitive insights of the red man and the analytical, knowledge-seeking nature of the black man propels us towards a greater understanding.
It's like they complement each other, right? Intuition provides the spark, the vision, and then reason comes in to analyze, to refine, to build upon that initial insight.
Exactly. And it's through this dynamic back and forth that we move towards the union of heaven and earth, of the higher and lower aspects of ourselves, the inner and the outer. And it's through this process that we eventually arrive at eternal knowledge and truth.
Oh, eternal knowledge and truth. That's a pretty lofty goal.
It is. But the text presents it as the natural outcome of this ongoing interplay between the red and black aspects of our soul. And then, shifting gears a bit, the conversation turns to the very nature of consciousness itself.
Okay, consciousness. What's it got to say about that?
It starts by defining human consciousness in a very simple way. It's simply the feeling of one's own being, that core sense of I am.
That fundamental awareness that we exist.
Exactly. And it introduces this concept of the plane of consciousness, which is essentially a snapshot, an instantaneously captured collection of all the different aspects of ourselves that we are currently aware of.
Like a single frame from the movie of our experience.
Precisely. And thinking, then, is understood as the movement of this plane of consciousness. But here's the key point. This movement is always coordinated by elements of the relative world. Our interactions, our perceptions, everything we encounter shapes how we think.
So our thoughts aren't just happening in a vacuum. They're always connected to the world around us, to our experiences.
Exactly. And this is why the text emphasizes that thinking, as the movement of the plane of consciousness, is inherently relative. It's tied to our particular perspective, to our limited experience.
Which makes sense, right? We can only think about things based on what we know, what we've experienced.
Right. And then it brings us back to the red and black aspects of the soul. Intuition is presented as the power of integral cognition, a complete, holistic way of understanding something. And reason is described as the capacity for differentiated cognition, the ability to break things down into their individual parts and understand them separately.
So it's like intuition gives us the big picture, the overall understanding, and then reason comes in to zoom in on the details.
Exactly. And then it gets into this concept of involution, which might sound a bit strange at first.
Involution, like the opposite of evolution.
Can seem that way, but in this context, it has a very specific meaning. Involution is described as the increasing fragmentation and differentiation of consciousness.
So like our consciousness is becoming more complex, more divided.
But here's the thing, this isn't necessarily presented as a negative thing. It's actually the very process by which we become individual beings, by which we become part of the world. It's how we participate in the differentiated divine consciousness.
So becoming more separate is actually what allows us to experience the world as individuals.
Precisely. And differentiation itself is described as a divine quality, the highest attribute of the noumenal substance. It's even equated with divine creativity.
Wow, so our ability to perceive things as separate is actually a reflection of the divine.
Exactly. And then it explains how the black man, representing reason, takes the integral perception provided by the red man, representing intuition, and analyzes it, breaks it down into its individual components.
So reason is kind of dissecting what intuition provides.
And this process of analysis leads to further differentiation, which then creates the potential for a return to synthesis, but on a higher level.
So we start with a unified understanding, then a reason breaks it apart, and then we put it back together again, but with a deeper, more nuanced understanding.
Exactly. It's a cycle of unity, differentiation, and then a return to unity, but on a higher level of consciousness. And the text even suggests that the richer our experiences are, the sharper our transitions in self-awareness become, and the brighter the nuances of our self-consciousness.
So a life filled with a variety of experiences actually contributes to a greater understanding of who we are.
Precisely. And the ultimate goal of this whole process is the complete projection of consciousness to the limits of what's referred to as Iya, which ultimately leads to becoming the great initiate and achieving divine unity.
Becoming one with the divine. That's a pretty profound goal.
It is. And the cycle of life and death is described as the oscillation of consciousness between these states, influenced by the pulsation of this physical realm, Iya.
So birth and death are just different points on a continuous journey.
Exactly. And then it goes into this concept of the curve of consciousness and the development of individuality. From our perspective here on Earth, the degree of consciousness can be visualized as a curve that's derived from a sine wave.
A sine wave, like a wavy line.
Yes. And the parts of the curve that fall below the axis are said to represent those periods between our incarnations when our consciousness isn't fully projected into the physical world.
So those times between lives, the times we don't consciously remember, are still a part of our overall journey.
Exactly. And embodied humans, like us, only possess full consciousness specific to a particular incarnation for brief moments, maybe at moments of peak experience or profound realization.
Those times when everything clicks, when we have a deep sense of knowing.
Exactly. And the development of individuality is directly linked to the awareness of our own distinct dignity on Earth. That sense of, I am a unique being with inherent value.
Recognizing our own worth, our own individual path.
And it contrasts this with what we see in the animal kingdom, where individuality is less pronounced and there's a stronger herd instinct.
Right. Animals are more driven by instinct and group behavior.
Exactly. And the text suggests that the awareness of feeling separate from nature, that sense of alienation, is actually the first step towards the consciousness of individuality.
So feeling like you don't quite fit in can actually be a sign that you're developing a stronger sense of self.
Precisely. And then the focus shifts to self-knowledge, specifically in what it calls the astral plane. It explains that individual consciousness and innes will involve our entire being, not just our physical body or intellect.
It's not just our brains that are experiencing the world, it's our whole being.
Exactly. And every perception we have, every experience, carries a unique imprint because of the individuality of the knowing principle within each of us. No two people will experience the same thing in exactly the same way.
We all have our own unique perspective, our own way of interpreting things.
Absolutely. And the individuality of our feelings is even more profound because our entire consciousness participates in each emotional experience.
So our emotional world is incredibly personal and unique.
And the journey of evolution is described as a process of perceiving the world through a wide range of feelings. And at every moment, we're perceiving something both through the aspect of our being that harmonizes with it and through our entire integrated self.
So we're always comparing what we experience with who we are, how we feel.
Exactly. And this leads to a really important point. In every perception, in every experience, it's necessary to simultaneously study the experience itself and to know ourselves through the nuances of that experience.
So we're not just learning about the world, we're learning about ourselves in relation to the world.
Precisely. And this leads into what the text frames as the paradox of loss and gain. It includes this quote from Bishop Albrecht, "That person is poor who finds satisfaction in nothing that God has created."
That's a powerful statement. It's saying that true wealth isn't about material possessions. It's about our capacity for joy, for finding meaning in the world.
Exactly. And it goes on to explain that the awareness of complete poverty, of lacking something fundamental, can paradoxically mark the beginning of something new.
It's like hitting rock bottom can be the catalyst for a new beginning.
Precisely. And it echoes that ancient wisdom. Only by losing everything will you achieve everything.
Letting go of the old to make way for the new.
And it reiterates that human development and self-consciousness are both the goals we're striving for and the direct result of our actions and experiences.
It's a continuous process of growth and self-discovery.
And then it gets into this really fascinating discussion about human potential and the ascent of the spirit, drawing on the ideas of Pico della Mirandola.
Oh, Pico della Mirandola. Wasn't he the one who said that God gave humans the freedom to choose their own nature?
That's the one. He said that at the moment of humanity's creation, God bestowed upon us all the seeds and germs of life, giving us the freedom to choose our own path, to shape our own destiny.
So we have the potential to become anything we choose.
In a sense, yes. And if we choose to see ourselves as the center of the universe, not in an egotistical way, but in a way that recognizes our connection to the divine, then we have the potential to achieve what's described as the solitary dwelling of the Father.
To become one with the divine source.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the text describes the person who ascends to these cloud-piercing heights of the Spirit as reaching a state where suffering ceases, all questions are answered, and a deep and abiding peace is experienced.
Sounds like a state of pure bliss.
And even while still existing in the world of sorrows, this person is said to exist in a universal consciousness, essentially becoming liberated.
So they're still here in the world, but they're not bound by it in the same way.
Right. And the characteristics of this liberated individual are described as being impervious to joy and sorrow, unshakable in their being, existing beyond love, fear, and hatred, unafraid of the world and not feared by it. They exist beyond the limitations of science and art as we understand them, yet they are filled with the essence of both.
Wow, it's like a completely different way of being.
And then it touches on the expansion of consciousness and the idea of unity, referencing Sir Edwin Arnold's image of individual drops merging into a vast sea.
A classic metaphor for spiritual union.
But then it presents this really interesting contrasting perspective, the idea that it's not just about the drop merging into the sea, but about the sea flowing into the drop.
So it's not about losing ourselves in something bigger, it's about that something bigger becoming a part of us.
Precisely. And this sea-wide consciousness, with its center everywhere and circumference nowhere, is presented as a great fact. Upon reaching this state, consciousness doesn't feel submerged or lost. It feels expanded enough to encompass everything.
That's a powerful image. And then the discussion shifts to the importance of faith. Not just faith in God, but also faith in oneself.
Yes, and it quotes Vladimir Solovyov. Faith in oneself, faith in the human personality is at the same time faith in God. for divinity belongs to man and to God, with the difference that God possesses it in eternal actuality, while man only attains it, only receives it. In the present state, there's only possibility, only aspiration.
So believing in ourselves is actually a way of recognizing the divine within us.
Exactly. And then it circles back to the idea of divine emanation, connecting to the earlier arcana we've discussed. It reminds us that in creating the world, the divine emanates principles, and the first 9 arcana reveal these principles as a cohesive system.
Each arcanum building on the previous one.
And it emphasizes that these 9 arcana are all speaking of the same universal spirit, but from different perspectives, on different planes of perception.
Different facets of the same underlying reality.
Right. And then the conversation turns to the concepts of time and sequence and how they shape our human understanding.
Time and sequence, how we perceive the world unfolding.
The principle of sequence, the idea that things happen in a particular order, is presented as the guiding principle of all human thinking.
We naturally think in terms of cause and effect, past, present, and future.
And the text points out that even when we move into abstract thought, we're essentially synthesizing our understanding of this linear flow of time into the principle of time itself.
So time is like the foundation of how we understand the world.
And when we approach any field of knowledge, it emphasizes the need to not only classify information, but also to identify the flow and development of relationships through time.
So it's not just about knowing the facts, it's about understanding how things have unfolded, how they're connected through time.
Precisely. And then it introduces the Kabbalistic concept of the 10 Sephiroth.
The 10 Sephirot, I've heard of those. They're like these fundamental principles in Kabbalah, right?
Yes. They're often depicted as a tree of life, each Sephirot representing a different attribute or emanation of the divine.
So it's a way of understanding the structure of creation, the different aspects of God.
Exactly. And the Sephirot, or Book of Creation, emphasizes the significance of the number 10, urging understanding and placing the Creator in his rightful place within this structure.
10 as a symbol of completeness, of wholeness.
And the first 10 arcana of the tarot are presented as a complete system related to the divine world, each one acting as a channel for the properties, principles, and aspects of the divine to flow down and create the world.
So the tarot is like a symbolic representation of the Sephirot, a way of understanding these divine principles.
Precisely. And this system is connected to the Semitic revelation and the Kabbalah, which is described as a timeless science of eternal truth.
Ancient wisdom that's been passed down through generations.
And then it emphasizes the idea that the lower world, the world we experience, is a reflection of the higher world.
As above, so below.
And it quotes the Zohar. The whole lower world is created like the higher world. Everything that exists in the higher world stands before us here below, as it were in its reflection. And at the same time, all this is only one thing.
So everything we see around us is a manifestation of a higher reality.
And the unity, perfection, and harmony of the universe point to the concept of a world-first cause, a single, eternal, and absolute substance, Ein Sof.
The ultimate source of all that is.
And then it talks about the divine act of creation, referencing the Idris Sutta, which describes the divine carrying out world creation according to absolute reason.
So creation is an act of divine intelligence and purpose.
And it emphasizes the Kabbalistic idea that before creation, the divine existed as one, without form or likeness.
The ultimate unity, beyond any image or description.
And then it lists the holy names of God that can be invoked in prayer, along with the names of the 10 Sephiroth.
A way of connecting with the different aspects of the divine.
And it explains the connection between the 10 Sephiroth and the first 10 arcana of the tarot as they relate to the divine world.
So, the tarot is a way of accessing these ancient teachings, of understanding the divine principles.
And it highlights the hierarchy within those first 10 arcana, with the first 3 representing the triune creating divinity elevated above the others.
The Trinity, the threefold nature of God.
And then it briefly mentions the law of potential energy, talking about how the amount of potential energy in a factor changes upon interaction with other force fields.
A bit of physics thrown in there.
And it introduces the idea of the price of the potential state of energy, which is like a coefficient that indicates how readily that energy can be used.
So it's not just about how much energy there is, it's about how accessible it is.
Exactly. And then it talks about the power of thought in the astral world, explaining that every thought becomes an active entity, uniting with a specific element.
Our thoughts have a real impact. They're not just fleeting things.
And it differentiates between bright thoughts, which become beneficial powers, and dark thoughts, which become demonic and harmful powers.
So we have a responsibility to be mindful of our thoughts.
And then it briefly notes the subjectivity of time, pointing out that without external perceptions, we'd lose our concept of time passing.
Time is relative to our experience.
And then it describes the human constitution as a dynamic system, the result of all the influences and interactions between the individual and the world.
We're constantly being shaped by our experiences.
And it concludes that humans are always closed systems relative to the external world, only differing by a tiny amount from a perfect state of equilibrium.
Like a self-contained ecosystem, constantly adjusting and rebalancing.
And then it includes a quote from Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa about true spiritual teachers. A very difficult task it is to teach others. A man can become a true spiritual teacher only when he has felt God and when God has commanded him to teach men.
So true teaching comes from direct experience, not just intellectual knowledge.
And it goes on to explain that all human work is synthetic in its essence, meaning it involves taking what we receive from higher sources and reconstructing it through our own experience.
Integrating knowledge into our being, making it our own.
And then it talks about the cyclical appearance of avatars, quoting the Bhagavad Gita, which says that a new Buddha appears when pure doctrine is threatened.
Like a divine intervention to restore balance.
And it quotes Gautama Buddha, when the pure doctrine threatens to disappear completely and people again fall into sensual desires and intellectual darkness, then a new Buddha is born.
A recurring pattern throughout history.
And Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa adds to this, the same avatar, having risen in one place, is considered by people to be Krishna, and having descended and risen again in another place, is considered by them to be Christ.
Different manifestations of the same divine principle.
And it suggests that every outstanding individual in history has a prototype in the semi-mythical traditions of ancient religions.
Archetypes that recur throughout time.
And then it describes the conditions for receiving sacred teaching, according to the Egyptian priests.
What are those conditions?
It says that Isis imparts her sacred teaching to those who strive for union with the divine essence through steadfastness, humility, temperance, and abstinence from sensual pleasures.
So it requires discipline and purification.
And then it talks about true rest, defining it as the absence of movement, struggle, and aspirations.
A state of complete peace.
And it says that this is only possible when one is either devoid of everything or encompasses everything.
Like the emptiness of a void or the fullness of the divine.
And it concludes that only perfect foolishness and absolute wisdom can provide rest.
An interesting paradox.
And then it describes the neophyte's experience, quoting Plutarch, who talks about the intense inner ordeal that initiates undergo.
A symbolic death and rebirth.
And then it outlines the characteristics of genius, quoting Johann Caspar Lavater, who says that the main characteristics are originality, independence, and an inimitable nature.
So genius is about being unique, thinking for yourself.
And it distinguishes between potential genius and active genius.
Like you can have the potential for genius, but you have to actually do something with it.
Exactly. And then it dispels the misconception that natural laws oppress humans.
Right. Some people think that rules and laws are there to limit us.
But the text argues that natural laws actually originate from human nature itself and are reflections of our own properties.
So they're not imposed on us from outside, they're part of who we are.
And divinely inspired religious laws are presented as the closest approximations to natural laws, guiding the development of the human spirit.
Laws as guiding principles, not restrictions.
And then it makes a big statement saying that world history illustrates that the knowledge of the Logos is a direct path to the knowledge of essence.
The Logos, the divine word, the principle of creation.
And it quotes the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
The power of language, the power of creation.
And then it quotes the teaching that the Lord created the world with a single word.
The creative power of the divine word.
And then it talks about the human desire for experience and growth, quoting Shamakov, who expresses a desire for the turmoil of life as a way for the spirit to grow stronger.
Embracing challenges as opportunities for growth.
And it describes the second era of development, where individuals fully identify with external life and pursue their goals with passion.
Immersing ourselves in the world, striving to achieve our dreams.
And then it revisits the definition of thinking as movement of consciousness.
Okay, back to consciousness.
It defines human consciousness as the feeling of I am. And the consciousness of the higher world is the direct feeling of the ego, while the consciousness of the world of being is the feeling of the ego through its imprinted aspects.
So different levels of consciousness, different ways of experiencing the self.
And it explains that the movement of consciousness is the change in the totality of these aspects. And the plane of consciousness is like a snapshot of this totality at any given moment.
Like a still frame from a moving film.
And it reiterates that thinking, as the movement of this plane of consciousness, is relative, because the plane is always coordinated by elements of the relative world.
Our thoughts are always shaped by our experiences.
And then it describes the process of seeking understanding through thought, which involves taking all the different aspects of a concept and synthesizing them until we arrive at a harmonious understanding.
It's a process of analysis and integration.
And then it distinguishes between divine and demonic aspects.
Okay, good versus evil.
The divine aspect is described as the highest development of harmony, where infinite particularities coexist in a unified whole governed by higher reason.
Everything working together in perfect harmony.
And the demonic aspect is the opposite, the highest degree of separateness, where each particularity strives for its own development without regard for others.
A chaotic state of division and conflict.
And then it talks about detachment in true life, quoting Yoga Vasishta. The deeds of the wise differ from the deeds of the madman only in that they bear no trace of any attachment.
So, true wisdom lies in letting go of our attachments.
And it describes the world of forms as a world of imprinted desires, an illusion, where true life is found in eternal movement, beyond these fixed forms.
Transcending the limitations of the physical world.
And it quotes Yoga Vasishta again. When all desires cease, then the world collapses into a non-existent nightmare.
The world as we know it is just a dream.
And then it briefly touches on the relationship between form and content, quoting Novalis, who says that form is antithesis and content is thesis.
Form as the outward expression, content as the inner essence.
And then it addresses the nature of evil, saying that it's a mistake to elevate it to the level of a cosmic force opposing good.
Evil isn't an equal and opposite force to good.